Well, thank you, Cynthia, for that wonderful introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I've had a really warm reception here, so I'm so thankful to all of you. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Is this a good sound? Okay, so I'm Stefanie Weisman. I'm the author of The Secrets of Top Students, Tips, Tools, and Techniques for Acing High School and College. So I'd like to talk to you tonight about some study strategies that you can follow to achieve academic success. But first of all, what do I mean by academic success? Sure, it's better grades, but it's more than just that. It's also about learning how to learn, studying more effectively, and achieving your potential as a student. So just to give you, let's see. Just to give you a brief rundown of why I wrote this book and of my background. So I was valedictorian of Stuyvesant High School in downtown New York City back in 1999. I then went to Columbia University where I majored in history and I graduated with the highest GPA in my class. I also won awards including Best Senior Thesis in History on a non-US topic, Best Performance in Columbia's Core Curriculum, as well as Phi Beta Kappa and Summa Cum Laude. After that, a few years later, I got a master's degree in art history from NYU, where I received a fellowship. And after that, I went off in a very different direction, and I got a BS in computer science, also from Columbia. The reason why I went from history and art history to computer science, it's kind of a long story, but I'll just say that it involves an ex-boyfriend. I've always been a top student, but it never came easy to me. I wasn't what you would call a natural. You know, for starters, I've always had very poor listening comprehension. So I'd often walk out of class with very little idea of what the teacher had been talking about. And it wasn't until I read the textbook or my notes that anything made much sense to me. I succeeded because I worked really hard, and I also developed a lot of powerful techniques for things like studying, writing papers, taking tests, things like that. And since I've always loved writing, it just felt natural for me to put these techniques down on paper so I could share them with other students. And that's what I did. It became this book you see here. But I wanted this book to be about more than just my experience. So I did a lot of research into the fields of education, learning, psychology, and I also surveyed 45 other top students to get their insight into what it takes to succeed academically. These people include 10 Rhodes Scholars, a National Spelling Bee champion, an Intel Science Fair finalist, lots of high school and college valedictorians, and students in the top law and medical schools in the country. So one thing I wanted to dispel in my book is this myth. The top students are naturals. They do well with relatively little effort. Because what I've seen, based on my own experience and that of the 45 top students, is this. Top students are made, not born. They succeed through effort and strong study skills. And by the way, I know that a lot of you are seniors and will be moving on, but I just want to say that these strategies will apply to you as well, especially if you're going to graduate school. You know, they're also valid for careers and just for learning in general. So I think that, you know, hopefully all of you will get something out of this. So I'd like to introduce to you what I call the SMARTER system, which contains my top strategies for academic success. And SMARTER is an acronym, and I'll reveal what each letter stands for as we go along. So the first letter, S, stands for space out your studying. I asked my group of 45 top students what their #1 study technique was, and I was really surprised by how similar and very simple their answers were. Most of them said things like, study a little at a time. Don't study one thing for too long. Avoid cramming at all costs, and spread out your studying. These homegrown techniques agree very well with what learning experts have been saying for years. They call this technique spacing or space distribution. So what is spacing? Well, let's first see a more accurate definition from one of the experts in this field, Dr. Robert Bjork. He says that the spacing effect is the finding that information that is presented repeatedly over spaced intervals is learned much better than information that is repeated without intervals, i.e. mass presentation. So what does this mean? Well, here's what this technique looks like visually. So as you can see in the top bar here, let's say you have a concept represented by A that you're trying to learn. And as you can see in the spaced method, you would leave time between each of 3 study sessions. Whereas in the masked method below, you have 3 consecutive study sessions without breaks, which is basically cramming. To put this in context, not all time is created equally. You would learn more by studying an hour tonight, an hour over the weekend, and an hour a week from now than you would by studying for 3 hours in a row. This is really simple and powerful. You're putting in the same amount of time, but you're getting more out of it. I think I'm just going to take this microphone off so I can move around a little bit. Okay. One other thing about spacing is this. Reviewing things over increasingly spaced intervals is better than reviewing them over equally spaced intervals. So for example, you might want to study something a few times a week when you're first learning it, then once a week, then once every 2 weeks, then once a month, and so on. You should keep increasing the time between your study sessions. However, you shouldn't wait until you've forgotten something to review it, because then you'll just waste time relearning it. So why does spacing work? Well, researchers aren't entirely sure, but there are several possible reasons. It gives the material time to sink in. That's pretty obvious. It forces you to recall what you've learned, and it allows you to pinpoint and correct your misunderstandings. There's a related concept called interleaving, which is when you alternate between the study of different concepts. So interleaving and spacing really go hand in hand. You could say that interleaving makes spacing more efficient. So as you'll see in this top box here, in the interleaving section, let's say you have 3 concepts that you're trying to learn, A, B, and C. So in the interleaving box, it goes A, B, C, B, C, A, C, B, A. So as you can see, the study of concept A is still spaced, like you can see in the spacing experiment. But instead of doing nothing between these study sessions, you're studying these other concepts. And as a plus, all 3 concepts are spaced out. So here's a study that I think is a really good example of spacing and interleaving. In this study by Cornell and Bjork, undergraduate students learned the styles of 12 different artists by looking at 6 paintings by each artist. They studied half the paintings using massing, meaning that they looked at 6 paintings by one artist, then 6 paintings by another artist, and so on. As you can see in section A, where there are 6 paintings by the same artist. Then they studied the rest of the painters by using spacing and interleaving, meaning that the paintings they looked at were all mixed up, which is more like the section B on the bottom. The students were then shown new paintings by the same 12 artists and asked to identify who painted each work. So this shows the results of the study. The line in blue represents the painters studied with spacing, and the line in red below are the painters studied with massing. So as you can see, also there were 4 separate blocks of tests in which students got corrective feedback when they made mistakes. And even with this correction, spacing outperformed massing every time. One really surprising thing about this concept is that most people underestimate how effective spacing really is. After the experiment, the students were asked, which do you think helped you learn more, massed or spaced presentation? And as you can see in these 2 columns on my left, the vast majority believed that massing was as good or better than spacing. But in reality, in terms of actual effectiveness, all of these bars in red, here, here, and here, were the students who actually did better with spacing than with massing. So the bottom line is that while massing may give you a feeling of confidence, you'll actually learn and retain much more with spacing. Now I'd like you to take a minute or two and try to think of some ways that you can add spacing and interleaving to your own everyday study sessions and practice. Think about what classes you have and what subjects you're studying, and think of some really concrete ways that you can apply these concepts. So if you could just take a minute, just maybe write some things down, and then I'll ask for a volunteer later. And if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me. Several different things to learn. An effective strategy is to interleave one study. Study a little bit of history, then a little bit of psychology, followed by a chapter of statistics, and go back again to history. Repeat, best if in a blocked randomized order. And blocked randomized just means that you shouldn't study things in a set pattern every time. Some other things you can do is switch between math questions from different chapters when you're studying for a test, because this will force you to think about when to apply different math concepts. Also, if you're studying a foreign language, you should try alternating between things like speaking, writing, vocabulary, and so on. So I mean, there are tons of ways you can apply this. Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, taking a break is spacing. You know, I mean, that's if we go back for a second, that's the slide, you know, with the spacing experiment here. I mean, here you're studying the concept A, but you are taking breaks in between each session. Versus interleaving, you know, you're also studying A spaced out. You see it's A, B, C, B, C, A, C, B, A, but you're filling in that time with the other two concepts. So yeah, I mean, taking breaks definitely works, and I totally, you know, encourage taking breaks because it lets your brain, you know, rest and renew itself. But if you want to be super efficient, you know, interleaving works because you're also mixing in your other subjects. Okay, so now let's move on to my next letter, M, which stands for make or research log. So this pertains to a task I'm sure many of you have struggled with, writing a research paper. And I think this is one of the most difficult things any student has to do because it involves such a wide range of skills. Things like researching, critical thinking, logic, creativity, persuasive writing, and so much more. So what do I mean by a research log? Well, it's essentially just a document that you prepare during the research stage of writing a paper. And it can take many different forms, but it's essentially a detailed summary of all your research done in a systematic, structured way. So instead of just reading through a pile of text and maybe slapping on a post-it note here and there, you're actively cataloging the material. So making a research log is actually pretty straightforward. You should start a new page for every source that you read. And the title and author, and the URL if it's on the web, should go at the top of the page. Your log should include things like the following: the title and author of each text. Oh, sorry, I already said that. The main points and conclusions the author makes. Anything you think is interesting or unexpected. Anything you think is important in terms of facts and statistics. And any quotes that you feel state the issue really well. You should also write down your thoughts and reactions to what you're reading. So for example, if you disagree with something the author says, or if there's a flaw in the author's argument. Make sure that you use quotation marks around quotes and indicate your own thoughts and reactions with asterisks or stars. Because later on, when you're actually writing the paper, you don't want to get confused between what you thought versus what the author actually said. And last but not least, make sure you write down the page number for everything. This will be a real lifesaver when it's time to write the paper. So why write a research log? They seem like a lot of work, but they really pay off in the end, as I've seen with my own personal experience. When you're reading a source, it's so easy to get bogged down in detail. Especially if you have a lot of text to read, it can be hard to make connections between things and see the big picture. But that's where the research log comes in. When you have all the key information in a condensed form in one place, it makes it so much easier to connect the dots and see the relationships between things. And this is really crucial when you have to think of a thesis. After you've read through your research log a couple of times, you might find that a light bulb just goes off inside your head. You know, the subconscious is so important when you're trying to think of that thesis. Second of all, when you're actually writing a paper, you won't have to think to yourself, now, where did I see that really great quote? And then go searching through all your text. Most of what you want to cite will already be right there in your research log with a page number where it came from. This is my own research log that I used for my senior thesis in college. This is the old-fashioned way to make a research log. As you can see, it's handwritten. It's really clunky. and it's got post-it notes everywhere. I actually recommend writing yours on the computer for a couple of reasons. You can search for things with Control F, which can come in handy. You can write out quotes quickly. You can copy and paste things into the actual paper later. And as you do additional research, it's much easier to add things to your log, move things around, put things in bolds, and so on. So it gives you a lot more flexibility. Does anyone have any questions about the research log? Okay, go on to my next one then. So A stands for answer test questions out of order. This is my #1 tip for taking tests. And while you shouldn't go crazy jumping randomly between questions, you should use a systematic method that'll maximize your score. And unless the test is super easy, answering the questions in order is not the most effective system. That's why I recommend the 3-pass approach, which goes like this. So in pass #1, you should answer the questions you know. That's pretty obvious. You should also answer the questions you can make an educated guess about, but make a mark next to them on the test or in your answer booklet. If there are questions you have no idea how to answer, skip them and circle the question number. So as you can see here, or hopefully you can see, I made some marks next to the ones that I wasn't sure about, and I circled the questions that I actually left out. Now we come to pass. Oh, sorry, let me go back for a second. So why do I recommend skipping questions? There are a few reasons. One, there's a good chance that you'll realize how to answer some of them while you're taking the rest of the test. Another question may give you a clue and remind you of something. And you also give your brain time to process those harder questions. Plus, you really want to avoid getting stuck on a hard question, losing precious time, and damaging your confidence. So now, in the second pass is when you should go back to the questions you circled, the ones that you did not know, and answer them to the best of your ability. There's a really good chance that by now something will have occurred to you and you can actually answer some of those questions. The third pass is when you should go back to the questions you made a mark next to, the ones you weren't too sure about, and again, go through those because there's a good chance that you'll have realized how to do them and see your mistakes. When you finish these 3 passes though, don't just hand in your test. You should always check your answers, including the ones that you were sure about, because of course we all make careless mistakes. And you studied a long time for this test, days, maybe even weeks. Why leave really just to save a few minutes? Yes?
Is there a reason why pass 2 and pass 3 go in that order?
I'm sorry?
Is there a reason why pass 2 and pass 3 are in that order?
Yeah, so the question was why are pass 2 and pass 3 in that order? So the first thing you should do after you've made your first pass is answer all the questions because you want to get maximum credit. So you should answer the questions that you did not answer before you go back to the questions that you kind of, maybe knew, just because it'll maximize the points you get. I mean, even if you still don't know the answers, you can still try to answer them and get partial, which is R, review notes early and often. A lot of students, as you can see, take notes in class and then don't look at them again until it's time to study for the exam. But this is a really bad use of your notes. What you should do, and I know it's hard, but is to review your notes as soon as possible, preferably on the same day as when you take them, and keep on reviewing them. So the reason why you want to do this is this chart, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, which shows how much information people can recall after learning something. As you can see, it's pretty dramatic. There's a really dramatic drop-off in what you can recall. Within 20 minutes of when you learn something, you've already forgotten about 40%. And after 4 days, you can remember maybe 20%. So this is why it's so important to take good notes and review them, because you won't retain much from what you actually heard during the lecture.